Thank you to Lynn and Scottish C&D for the invitation for me to be here at your AGM. I want to start by acknowledging the Indigenous and colonised peoples of the world who have been disproportionately affected by nuclear weapons testing, including the Aboriginal people of Australia, who were the primary victims, along with veterans, of the British testing in Australia in the 50s and 60s. Of course, Britain, along with France, the US and other nuclear states, also tested heavily in the Pacific and other locations around the world. Many of the survivors and their children, who continue to suffer debilitating health issues, are still waiting for compensation and environmental remediation of their lands. It's just over a year since I started my role as Executive Director with ICANN, and about a year since I was with you in Glasgow at your wonderful Festival for Survival, and when I also had the pleasure, the honour of being escorted to by friends to Faslane and the Scottish Parliament. Can I say that we desperately need Scotland to hurry up and become independent, given how the British government has been handling things? 2 weeks ago, as Lynn mentioned, I participated in a C&D action at RAF Lakenheath to protest US nuclear weapons being stationed in the UK once again, and the practice of nuclear sharing. There was a great crowd there, letting the British and American governments know that the British people don't want anything to do with nuclear weapons, whether they're British or American. And I'm very sure that the British people don't want their government complicit in a genocidal war in Gaza either. Some of you may recall that over 20 years ago, I worked for the UN refugee agency known as UNRWA in Gaza for 2.5 years. I remember attending Hiroshima and Nagasaki commemoration ceremony at the Gaza harbour one evening in August. Hundreds of Palestinian children had made little paper boats with candles in them. They set those little boats afloat on the harbour, and it was extraordinarily beautiful and very moving to think that here were children who were themselves being bombed on a regular basis, remembering children in another time and place who'd been bombed. And earlier this year, I met with, I visited Japan and Hiroshima and Nagasaki for the first time. And I met with Hibakusha. And I realised that these were some of the same children, now in their 80s and 90s, who were being remembered by the children of Gaza all those years ago. And it was those same Hibakusha who have been recognised now as this year's Nobel Peace Laureates, with Nihon Hidankyo, who were leading nightly rallies in Gaza, in support of Gaza in Hiroshima, because they recognised that these issues are linked across space and time. It's the same ways of thinking that justify nuclear weapons, the same readiness to exterminate innocent others, including children, are still happening today. And some of the same countries and same companies financing nuclear weapons are facilitating the genocide in Gaza and other conflicts. The international security environment is truly terrifying, with increasing polarisation, confrontation and militarisation. The two major conflicts in the world today involve nuclear armed states, and nuclear threats have been made in both of those contexts. There has been an almost complete breakdown in arms control agreements, and we have a new nuclear arms race underway. We are really standing on the edge of a nuclear abyss, and our governments have the responsibility to keep us safe, but what are they doing? They are pushing us right over the edge. There was a serious fire 2 weeks ago at the plant that makes Britain's nuclear subs in the northwest of England. The nuclear reprocessing plant at Sellafield was fined for cyber security failings. Submariners, British submariners, We're running severely short on food because of the maintenance problems of the nuclear subs causing the extension of missions. In Scotland, the aging nuclear submarines are also leaking the radioactive gas tritium. At Coolport, where the nuclear weapons warheads are stored, tritium gas leakage doubled between 2018 and 2023, from 1.7 billion to 4.2 billion units of radioactivity. Faslane also discharged liquids contaminated with tritium into the Gairloch, amounting to a total of over 50 billion units of radioactivity from 2018 to 2023. So fires, cybersecurity failings, maintenance problems, and a big increase in radioactive tritium emissions from aging nuclear subs. What could possibly go wrong? And now you've got US nuclear weapons coming to the UK. As we know, more nuclear weapons in the UK means the higher the risk of their use, whether on purpose or by accident. And it makes the UK more of a target, more chances for everyone to die in a nuclear war or a nuclear winter, something that was shown so effectively in the movie Threads that was rebroadcast by the BBC a few weeks ago. I'm not sure if you saw that in Scotland, but you know the film is 40 years old and more relevant than ever. So what goes on at Lakenheath, Sellafield, Coolport, Faslane, and every other site connected with nuclear weapons is a threat to all of us wherever we live, and it's an affront to democracy. For two countries that pride themselves on being cradles of liberal democracy, the secrecy of the British and American governments around nuclear weapons constitutes gross hypocrisy, and it is unacceptable. To add insult to injury, the UK government has rammed through Parliament the indefinite extension to the US-UK Mutual Defence Agreement. As an Australian looking at the disaster that is AUKUS, I am concerned, as I'm sure you are, about the loss of independence, the loss of sovereignty in defence and foreign policy that comes along with blind reliance on and submission to the US military machine. Whether it's the British nukes or the United States deploying its bombs at Lakenheath or across the North Sea in Belgium, Germany or the Netherlands or Italy or Turkey, or whether it's Russia putting its weapons in Belarus, it increases the danger in Europe, but also for the rest of the world. Nuclear exercises and modelling have shown over and over again that there is no such thing as a limited nuclear war. And if you haven't yet read Annie Jacobson's book, Nuclear War, A Scenario, I urge you to do so. It is absolutely gripping and terrifying. It's like a second by second, minute by minute explanation of what will happen when nuclear deterrence fails. All based on, real life scenarios. And brilliant research by Annie Jacobson, who is a journalist. Shamefully, last year, the UK was one of only 4 countries, the others being Russia, North Korea, and France, to oppose a UN resolution to help radiation victims of nuclear testing and to restore the environment at past test sites. And just 2 weeks ago at the UN General Assembly First Committee, the UK was one of only 3 countries to oppose a UN resolution to establish a scientific study on the local, regional and planetary impacts of a nuclear war. What has the British government got to fear from science? So the need for a paradigm shift from military security to human security has never been clearer or more urgent. And ICAN is seeking to break down the silos where nuclear weapons are only discussed in disarmament and security fora, and only so-called defence or security experts, usually older white men, get to talk about nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are not separate from other global concerns. They are deeply interconnected. They are a profound violation of the human rights to life, health, a safe workplace, and a clean environment, among others. There is no way that nuclear weapons can be used consistently with international law, since any use would involve indiscriminate and disproportionate killing of hundreds of thousands or even millions of innocent civilians, and the wholesale destruction of heritage, infrastructure, and the environment. Nuclear weapons are also bad for the economy and trade, with many people killed or injured, communications and infrastructure destroyed, and people not able to easily move from one place to another. Trade and business will be impossible to sustain. Nuclear weapons are also bad for everyone's health. I was able to meet earlier this year with Dr. Tedros, the head of the World Health Organization, who immediately understood that nuclear risks are health risks. He referred to the fact that in August last year, more than 150 medical journals from around the world, including The Lancet, issued a joint call for urgent action to eliminate nuclear weapons as a public health priority. He also talked about the other reasons nuclear risks are health risks. That is, firstly, the millions of dead and injured from a nuclear detonation. Secondly, the long-term far-reaching radiation that will poison the people who survive the explosion and successive generations and contaminate the environment. Thirdly, the fact that there can be no health or humanitarian emergency response to a nuclear detonation because infrastructure is destroyed and health and humanitarian workers would be dead or incapacitated. Plus, that you could not have any humanitarian workers coming in from outside the impacted area because of the deadly radiation. So even if you survive a nuclear detonation initially, you can expect no help from anyone from the outside because of the radiation. So because there's no actual humanitarian or health response possible to a nuclear detonation, what you cannot prepare for, you have to prevent. And the only way to prevent this scenario is the complete elimination of nuclear weapons. And fourthly, the fact that scientists now confirm, and in most recent, it was Science in the Nature Food Journal in 2022, scientists confirmed that even a limited nuclear war would lead to global climate disruption and cause agricultural collapse and the death by starvation of billions of people in a nuclear winter. A major nuclear war would mean the end of human civilization and most other forms of life. The doomsday clock earlier this year put humanity at 90 seconds to midnight, the closest we've ever been to global catastrophe based on the twin existential threats of nuclear weapons and the environment crisis. And it's really significant that they linked those issues. Biodiversity is already under extreme threat. A nuclear winter would cause the sixth mass extinction to come even sooner. In addition to nuclear winter, there are further connections between nuclear weapons and the environment that are important to highlight because a lot of people aren't really aware of this. Firstly, that governments and industry have still not solved the problem of how to deal with extremely dangerous radioactive nuclear waste that can remain harmful for tens of thousands and even hundreds of thousands of years. Just to take an example of the Hanford Nuclear Reservation in Washington State, where a lot of nuclear weapons activity used to occur, they're still dealing with the cleanup there. And they have 55 million gallons of highly radioactive nuclear waste stored in 177 underground steel containers that were put there like 20 years ago and expected to last about 20 years until they had some solution. Well, now those containers are leaking. The waste is going into the nearby Columbia River. And any gas explosion would cause another Chernobyl. I mean, it is an absolute disaster. It's already cost them $756 billion so far in the cleanup, and they still haven't cleaned it up. And that's just one example of one place. The US Environmental Protection Agency calls it the most toxic place in America. And there are lots of those toxic places around the world. Nuclear weapons production and testing damage the environment and increase carbon emissions, exacerbating the climate crisis. At the same time, the increase in extreme weather events and rising sea levels caused by the climate crisis accelerates the risks of radioactive contamination from nuclear weapons activities. And earlier this year, wildfires in Texas came close to the Pantex nuclear weapons facility, leading to evacuation and widespread alarm. You may also have heard of the Runit Dome in the Marshall Islands, which is the US conducted 67 nuclear weapons tests in the Marshall Islands when the Marshall Islands were under the trusteeship of the United States. So it's one way to carry out your trusteeship duties is to put nuclear weapons on the people you're supposed to be looking after. 67 of them in one of those craters, they deposited the equivalent of 35 Olympic swimming pools worth of highly radioactive nuclear waste, and they covered it over in the 70s with a concrete dome. That dome is now cracking. With sea level rising, that waste is now escaping into the Pacific Ocean. This is a very clear example of how we're seeing a whole lot of issues all combining in one place. You know, you've got the nuclear weapons, got the impact of colonization and racism. You've got the environmental contamination, and also the people have been displaced from their atolls. I mean, they're suffering major health issues through successive generations, including giving birth to what they call jelly babies. It's absolutely heartbreaking. They can't practice their traditional cultures and foods because of the contamination of the marine environment. So they're displaced into urban slums where they're forced to rely on imported food from the United States, and that's creating a problem of obesity and diabetes and heart disease that they never had before. So there's all these run-on impacts that don't really get talked about very often, but they're all part of it. And so you just see that it's just this catastrophe all in one. So that's a demonstration of how these issues are all really linked. Going back to the environmental consequences of nuclear weapons, like a nuclear war will become much more likely due to a climate crisis-driven rise of resource scarcity and conflict. Various studies have shown strong support for a causal connection between changes in climate and increased conflict. Nuclear weapons are diverting resources from dealing with other global challenges, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And finally, I'm sure I mentioned this last year when I was with you, nuclear war would have a devastating impact upon the environment and all living things. And that's why the Japanese research concluded last year that the priority for animal species conservation must be 1, prevent nuclear war, 2, decrease deforestation, 3, reduce pollution, and 4, limit global warming in that order. So the abolition of nuclear weapons is an essential part of protecting and respecting the planet, the climate, humanity, and all living things. There really can be no nuclear weapons on a sustainable planet. Today, there are around 12,000 nuclear weapons globally, and more than $90 billion is squandered every year, enhancing and expanding nuclear arsenals. It's time for the UK to live up to the commitment to disarm that it made over 50 years ago when it joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The new UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or the TPNW, which half of all countries in the world have now joined, provides the pathway under international law for nuclear powers to get rid of their weapons in a verifiable manner. It also provides for victim assistance and environmental remediation for those communities impacted by nuclear weapons use or testing. And the treaty recognises the disproportionate impact that nuclear weapons have on women and girls and on Indigenous peoples. So the TPNW is not only a disarmament treaty, it's a human rights treaty and an environment treaty, as well as being a feminist treaty. The TPNW is democratising the nuclear weapons debate by taking it out of the hands of the nuclear armed states, including the Permanent Five of the Security Council, and bringing it into the General Assembly, where every country has an equal vote. The UN meetings of the TPNW are mainly led from the Global South, are very inclusive of civil society, scientists, academics, women, young people, representatives from communities that have suffered the catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons. So the TPNW is an important new addition to international law and an example of effective multilateralism at a time when those things are increasingly under threat. For decades, the narrative around nuclear weapons was controlled primarily by those who have them. And their message has been nuclear weapons provide stability and security. Well, I can help to change this by focusing the conversation on what would happen if, or more likely when, nuclear weapons are used, whether by accident or design. I can show the real security impact of nuclear weapons by highlighting the incontrovertible evidence from Hiroshima and Nagasaki and from the more than 2,000 nuclear weapons tests carried out around the world that nuclear weapons cause indiscriminate catastrophic harm to humans and the environment across long periods of time and even in regions far distant from the site of nuclear explosions. Highlighting those real-world impacts of nuclear weapons has shifted the conversation around nuclear weapons from the theory, the deterrence theory that these things keep us safe, to the reality of the horror that awaits all of humanity from any use of nuclear weapons. And that has informed and empowered a broad range of stakeholders, including civil society, financial institutions, communities impacted by nuclear weapons use and testing, governments who were previously marginalised, to stand up and demand a policy shift. And so the TPNW came into being, and it has having a major impact. The TPNW is challenging the false narratives about nuclear deterrence and has identified deterrence as a major obstacle to disarmament. A working group was set up at the second meeting of states parties to the TPNW to examine the security concerns arising from the humanitarian and environmental consequences of nuclear weapons, the growing risk of their use, and the threat that deterrence policies pose to the rest of the world. This working group, led by Austria, will report on its work at the third meeting of states parties next year. And its work will make a useful contribution to the UN scientific study on the local, regional and planetary impacts of nuclear weapons that will be happening now, even though the UK voted against it. Late last year, the states parties to the TPNW made a powerful declaration, and I'd like to read out a few paragraphs from it to you because I think they're really great. We reject attempts to normalise nuclear rhetoric and any notion of so-called responsible behaviour as far as nuclear weapons are concerned. The threat of inflicting mass destruction runs counter to the legitimate security interests of humanity as a whole. This is a dangerous, misguided and unacceptable approach to security. Nuclear threats should not be tolerated. Far from preserving peace and security, nuclear weapons are used as instruments of policy, linked to coercion, intimidation and heightening of tensions. The renewed advocacy of, insistence on and attempts to justify nuclear deterrence as a legitimate security doctrine give false credence to the value of nuclear weapons for national security and dangerously increase the risk of horizontal and vertical nuclear proliferation. There are now more states under extended nuclear security guarantees and nuclear stationing arrangements than when we last met. We urge all states with such nuclear arrangements to put an end to them and join the Nuclear Ban Treaty. This is not only a security issue. In a world where challenges persist in meeting basic human needs, the investment of substantial financial resources in modernising and expanding nuclear arsenals is indefensible and counterproductive, as it comes at the expense of investment in sustainable development for genuine human well-being, as well as disarmament, education, diplomacy, environmental protection and health. So ICAN has been working to highlight the opportunity cost of the $91 billion of public resources being squandered by nuclear-armed states on their nuclear weapons each year. For instance, 1 million trees could be planted for every minute of nuclear weapons spending. Imagine what we could do to tackle the Sustainable Development Goals and the environment crisis with $91 billion per year, not to mention the brain power in scientists and researchers currently employed in the nuclear weapons industry that could be working instead to help improve the world instead of helping to destroy it. The modernisation of nuclear weapons currently taking place means the burden and the risk of nuclear weapons will fall on young people for decades further into the future. And so young people are seeing that nuclear weapons are, like climate change, a matter of intergenerational injustice. 8.1 billion was spent by the UK last year on its nuclear weapons, which is 17% more than the year before, and a 43% increase over 4 years. It's around £100 per person in the UK. And I'm sure every one of us can think of a much better use for £100 than going into nuclear weapons. The new British government has doubled down on its commitment to nuclear weapons while saying they will make spending cuts in other services. If instead Britain were to eliminate its nuclear weapons and join the TPNW, it would not only have money to spend on services the people actually want, it would be helping to make the world safer, and it would be providing moral and political leadership to the other nuclear-armed states, in the same way that Britain once led the way in ending the transatlantic slave trade. Of all the global challenges out there, nuclear weapons are the least complex. Humans built nuclear weapons and humans can dismantle them. All it requires is political will and leadership. And at the moment, that leadership is coming from the TPNW states, mostly from the Global South and from civil society. Scottish C&D is bringing this issue to the public in your country, just as ICAN works to bring the message globally. Nuclear weapons and humanity cannot coexist, and they cannot exist on a sustainable world. In a sustainable world. The next year is going to be really important for our movement, starting with the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony in just 3 weeks on the 10th of December, International Human Rights Day, when Nihon Hidankyo will receive the Nobel Peace Prize for their courage to tell their harrowing stories again and again in the hope that the world will listen. Now, every time they have to tell their story, they are reliving a childhood trauma. And, they keep doing it, but it's a terrible thing that they take on themselves to do to get the message out. And hopefully the world will start listening. The Nobel Peace Prize will be really the kickoff for the 80th anniversary next year of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, which will come to a head on the 6th and 9th of August. Next July will also be the 80th anniversary of the world's first nuclear weapons test, Trinity. So that will be something we will be highlighting as well. And next year will be the 70th anniversary of the Bertrand Russell Albert Einstein Manifesto, in which the authors begged world leaders to turn aside from war and nuclear weapons, to remember their humanity and forget the rest. Of course, the third meeting of states parties to the TPNW will be held in New York in early March next year, and we hope to see some of you there. I can go into more detail later about 3MSP for those who are interested. So it's a very big year ahead, and we hope you will be part of amplifying the key message, which is the incredible urgency of the need to abolish nuclear weapons. That the risk of the use of nuclear weapons is higher than it has ever been. It's higher than even during during the Cold War. It's because, I mean, we have a multiplicity of nuclear armed states now, and we have a complete environment of complete polarization and mistrust. At least during the Cold War, the two nuclear powers were talking to each other. Now that's not happening. So finally, I want to thank you all for being here and for your continued engagement and action on this issue. We need you to keep raising your voices. A few things you can do personally or in a small group. Ask your banks, universities, and pension funds about their ethical investment policies and demand that they divest from nuclear weapons if they have those investments. Speak to your local MPs about the TPNW and ask them to raise it in their party rooms and in the Parliament. And I know you've got a great champion there in Bill Kidd, and we need other MPs to be active as well. And since cities are the primary targets of nuclear weapons, make sure your local governments are part of the ICANN Cities Appeal in support of the TPNW. So working together, each of us lighting our own small candle, is how we can and we will eliminate nuclear weapons from the earth.